Hi folks, so this is related to my last video about replica swords often being a poor replication of original swords, especially for the medieval period, but it's true for other periods and other geographic areas as well. One of the key reasons for that is distal taper. So a lot of you watching these videos will know exactly what distal taper is, and you can probably stop watching at this point, but for those of you who don't know what distal taper is, it is essentially, if we take a sword, let's just grab the long sword. So, generally speaking, we would say that this sword is tapered, okay? i.e. it is broad at the base and it tapers to a point, okay? Now that is one plane in which it is tapered. However, it is also tapered in the other plane, in the plane of the edge, okay? So it starts off about probably 9mm thick at the base here, maybe as much as a centimetre thick at the base of the blade here, and obviously it narrows down such that at what we call the centre of percussion, or the optimum cutting point of the blade, it's probably only about 6mm thick, maybe 5mm. And then if we come to the tip of the blade, obviously before we get to the point, because that's 0mm thick, but if we go to about there, it's probably only about 3 or 4mm thick there. And that's a fairly standard distal taper for a longsword, and this is what we call distal taper. It's getting thinner along the course of the blade. Now, first thing to say is not all swords are distally tapered. There are certain types of sword, and actually this is a fairly good example. If a sword has a very strong taper in this plane of the blade, often you'll find it doesn't have a particularly strong distal taper in this plane of the blade, because the tip is made light and therefore the sword handles in a nice way by virtue of the fact that the blade shape is tapering anyway. Okay, so it doesn't need to distally taper as much. There are other reasons at play here. You can in fact get broad-bladed swords that don't have much distal taper. If you take a modern kind of example that many of you may be familiar with, a machete generally has no distal taper. They're stamped out of a flat piece of steel, and therefore they tend to flex in the middle of the blade and are a bit floppy, but they're okay for chopping foliage and thin pieces of wood and so on. Okay, but for parrying and fencing with a blade that you want to be responsive, generally speaking you want a blade that's stiffer, that often means that you have to have some form of taper in the blade, whereby there's more mass in this part of the blade than there is in this part of the blade. Okay, now we go back to the replica I was holding at the beginning of the video. This is a Deltin, I don't remember the code number, but it's a sort of 12th century, probably, maybe 13th century, I can't remember, style of sword. And this is an example of not a very good replica, in my opinion. Deltin do make some replicas which are okay, however this, in my opinion, is one of their poorer examples. And this is essentially the same thickness there as it is there, as it is about there. It actually does get a bit thinner, but only right at the end of the blade. Now if we look at most historical examples of this type of sword, they will be thicker here than the replica is. They will be about the same as the replica is there, and they will be thinner for this whole end of the blade than the replica is. So the result is they are stiffer in this part of the blade and thicker. They're about the same in the middle, and they are much thinner and flatter in this portion of the blade. Okay, and the result is you end up with a sword that handles a lot nicer, and in actual fact you can get a finer edge on the cutting and thrusting portion of the blade, so it will cut better as well to some extent. And the reason that lots of modern replica swords are made essentially out of a flat piece of steel is, unfortunately, economy. It is in modern sword making, it is normal to use CNC or grinding, in other words milling, grinding, a stock removal process. And in that process you take a flat piece of steel and you remove material from it. Therefore, to be economical, or in terms of time or money or material, you start with a flat piece of steel and you finish with a flat piece of steel, generally speaking. Okay? In traditional sword making, you generally start with an ingot of steel that is forged into shape. And if you're forging a piece of steel, it's no extra effort to end up with a thick part of the blade here and a thin part of the blade here, because you're forging it, you're squashing it out into the shape you want. And unfortunately most modern replicas are not made that way. They're made on a machine from a flat piece of steel, and as a result we get flat piece of steel swords. And these generally bend in the wrong place, they bend too much in the middle, they don't handle right because they're too heavy in the tip, they're too thin at the base of the blade. So when you see me judging a modern replica sword, sometimes viewers ask me what I think about a certain make. If I say it doesn't have enough distal taper for the type, bearing in mind not all types of sword have a lot of distal taper, or some don't even have any distal taper, but if I say that a certain replica has too little distal taper, that's what I'm talking about. And unfortunately it is a big flaw of modern replica swords, and unless people pay more money for things like Albion swords, then I'm afraid that's what you get. You do get a sword that isn't really realistic to the original. And to mention one specific example, the Cold Steel 1796 sabre, I've owned several of the originals of those, and I know two people who have the replica, the Cold Steel version. And if you put the antique next to the replica, they're really quite different swords. For a start, they feel very different in the hand. The Cold Steel one is essentially too thin down here, and it's too fat up here. So the result is that the Cold Steel weapon feels kind of like a cleaver, when in actual fact, the original 1796 sabre feels very light in the hand, very responsive, very more slicey, whereas the Cold Steel one feels a bit like an axe. So in actual fact, although the Cold Steel one in a picture or in a photo might look like the original 1796 sabre, it's actually a very different sword in the hand. It's just disguised as the historical version. Okay, I hope that helps. Thank you.